Chapter 7. Truths Unveiled. The pale light of dawn had not yet touched the eastern sky when Nathaniel folded his spare shirt and tucked it into his saddlebag. Sleep had eluded him, his mind churning with what lay ahead in San Antonio and what he'd leave behind in Fort Worth. He moved through the small house with the practiced silence of a man accustomed to treading softly. From the adjoining bedroom, Susan's gentle breathing carried through the half-open door, punctuated occasionally by tiny sighs that tugged at something deep in his chest. Grace would be awake soon. She rose with the chickens, a habit born of years attending births at all hours. The thought of facing her goodbye twisted his insides more painfully than any bullet wound he'd suffered in his years as a ranger. A soft knock at the front door froze him mid-motion. His hand moved instinctively to the revolver at his hip as he approached the window, easing aside the curtain just enough to peer into the pre-dawn darkness. The silhouette on the porch was familiar enough to loosen his grip on the weapon, yet not welcome. Thomas Blackwood. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, reminding himself that the cattle broker had every right to call, even at this unseemly hour. Hadn't Grace known him since childhood? Weren't they once sweethearts before life pulled them in different directions? The knot in Nathaniel's gut tightened as he unlatched the door. "Mr. Blackwood," he greeted, keeping his voice low. "What brings you here before the roosters?" Thomas removed his hat, the gesture displaying impeccable manners that only deepened Nathaniel's discomfort. "Sheriff Hayes, I apologize for the early hour, but I heard from Jameson at the livery that you'd be riding out at first light. I hope to have a word before your departure." Nathaniel hesitated, then stepped back. "Come in, but Grace and Susan are still sleeping." Thomas nodded, following him into the small parlor, where a single lamp cast long shadows across the worn floorboards. In the weak light, Thomas cut an impressive figure, tailored coat despite the early hour, polished boots, and a confidence that spoke of his success in business. Unlike Nathaniel's weathered appearance, Thomas looked like a man who belonged in a fine home with a proper family. "Coffee?" Nathaniel offered, more from courtesy than hospitality. "No, thank you. I won't stay long." Thomas twisted his hat in his hands, a surprisingly nervous gesture from a man usually so composed. "I came to speak with you about Grace and the child." Nathaniel stiffened. "What about them?" "I understand the arrangement you've made with Grace." Thomas cleared his throat. "Word travels in a town like this. The story you've put about is convincing enough for strangers, but those who know Grace well can see the truth of things." "And what truth is that?" Nathaniel's voice hardened. "This marriage is one of necessity, not affection." Thomas met his gaze directly. "That little Susan isn't your child by blood. That Grace found herself in circumstances requiring protection, and you provided it through a marriage certificate." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "You presume much, Mr. Blackwood." "I presume only what Grace herself has confirmed," Thomas replied, his voice softening. "She didn't betray your confidence willingly, but when I pressed her about how she came to marry a Texas Ranger she'd never mentioned in her letters, she couldn't maintain the falsehood. Not with me." "What is it you want?" Nathaniel asked, his patience wearing thin. Thomas straightened. "I want to offer Grace and Susan a proper home, a proper life. Once your arrangement has served its purpose, I'm prepared to adopt Susan legally and make Grace my wife." The words landed like physical blows, but Nathaniel kept his expression neutral. "And Grace knows about this proposal?" "I intend to speak with her this morning, but I wanted to approach you first, man to man." Thomas took a step forward. "You're pursuing dangerous men, Sheriff Hayes. Your duty takes you away from them, leaves them vulnerable. I can offer stability, security. My business is established now. I can provide everything Grace and that child need." "Including discretion about Susan's origins?" Nathaniel couldn't keep the edge from his voice. Thomas had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I would keep their secret. No one need ever know Susan wasn't born to Grace. In time, perhaps even the child herself need never learn the truth of her parentage." Nathaniel turned away, unable to bear the reasonableness of it all. Every word Thomas spoke made perfect sense. A respectable businessman versus a ranger with enemies. A childhood sweetheart versus a husband of convenience. A man who could stay versus one duty compelled to leave. I'll relay your offer to Grace, he said finally, his voice hollow. I'd prefer to speak with her myself, Thomas insisted. It's not yet 5 in the morning, Mr. Blackwood. Let the woman sleep. Nathaniel's patience had reached its limit. You can call at a more appropriate hour after I've departed. Thomas studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Very well. I'll return at noon. He settled his hat back on his head and moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. For what it's worth, Hayes, I believe you're an honorable man. You stepped in when Grace needed protection. I respect that. But she deserves more than a temporary arrangement born of crisis. The door closed quietly behind him, leaving Nathaniel alone with thoughts darker than the night outside. He sank into a chair, elbows on his knees, head bowed as if beneath an invisible weight. How much of that did you hear? He asked without looking up. Grace stepped from the shadows of the hallway, her wrapper pulled tight around her nightdress. In the dim lamplight, her face was unreadable, but the tension in her shoulders spoke volume. Enough, she answered quietly. Thomas never did understand the meaning of appropriate timing. Nathaniel ran a hand through his hair. Can't fault his logic, though. He's offering you everything I can't. Grace moved into the room, her bare feet silent on the boards. You were going to relay his offer to me, as if I were goods to be bartered between gentlemen? That's not fair, Grace. Isn't it? She took the chair opposite his, leaning forward. Tell me true, Nathaniel. Would you have encouraged me to accept? The question twisted in him like a knife. I would have told you to consider it carefully. He raised his eyes to hers. Thomas can give you and Susan respectability without condition. A proper home. Safety. Safety, Grace repeated, the word flat on her tongue. And what of you? Where do you fit in this vision of our future? Nathaniel stood, moving to the window where the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky. I don't. That's the point. He kept his back to her, unable to face the truth in her eyes. Once Montgomery's remaining men are captured, once we've confirmed what happened to Catherine, the danger to Susan will be gone. You'll be free to make a new life. A real life. Without pretense. And you? Her voice was closer now, though he hadn't heard her move. Will you simply ride away? Back to ranging? To hunting the next outlaw? The question dug into the very heart of what he'd been avoiding these past weeks. It's what I do, Grace. It's who I am. No. The single word carried such conviction it turned him around. She stood not 3 feet away, her eyes bright with unspent tears. It's what you do, not who you are. I've seen who you are, Nathaniel Hayes. Have you now? A bitterness he hadn't intended crept into his voice. And who might that be? A man who rocks a feverish baby through the night, singing lullabies he remembers from his own mother. A man who carries water so a midwife won't strain her back after a difficult birth. A man who mends a fence for a widow without being asked, who tips his hat to every lady he passes, who never takes the last biscuit at supper. Each example struck him like an arrow. That's who you are. The badge, the gun, those are just trappings. Nathaniel shook his head. You don't understand. My duty isn't something I can set aside. I made promises. Duty? Grace's patience finally snapped. Always duty. You hide behind that badge like it's armor, Nathaniel, but it's not protecting you from danger. It's protecting you from living. That's not true. But even to his own ears, the protest sounded weak, isn't it? For weeks now, I've watched you with Susan, with me. You care for us, I know you do, but every time we get too close, you retreat behind duty, behind promises made to others. Her hands balled into fists at her sides. It's easier to honor promises to the dead than risk new ones to the living, isn't it? The accusation struck too close to home, igniting a defensive anger. You think this is easy for me? Leaving you both unprotected while I chase down leads, knowing that every day I spend with you puts a target on your backs? His voice rose despite his efforts to control it. You have no idea what men like Montgomery's brother are capable of. Then tell me, she demanded. Stop protecting me from the truth and treat me like a partner in this. You want the truth? Something broke loose inside him, a floodgate he'd kept sealed for too long. The truth is that everyone I've ever loved has been used against me. My mother, my sisters, my brother. Each name fell like a stone. The Montgomery gang didn't just take our ranch, they took hostages to force my father to sign over the deed. And when he did, they killed them anyway. All of them. While I watched, hidden in the root cellar, Grace's face paled, her anger dissolving into horror. Nathaniel. I was 15. The confession poured out of him now, unstoppable. I didn't do anything, couldn't do anything, just listen to my family die while I cowered in the dark. That's your hero, Grace. That's the man you think knows how to protect what matters. He turned away, unable to bear the pity he was certain would fill her eyes. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant crow of a rooster announcing the coming day. Is that why you became a ranger? Grace asked finally, her voice gentle. To atone for something that was never your fault? The question pierced him. I became a ranger to ensure it never happened again. To stop men like Montgomery. And in doing so, you denied yourself any chance of a family that could be taken from you. Her footsteps approached, but she didn't touch him. You're still hiding in that cellar, Nathaniel. Still letting them win. He turned to face her, startled by how clearly she saw through to his core. It's not that simple. It never is. Grace's eyes held his, unwavering. But consider this. What if Susan and I are not your weakness, but your strength? What if having something to fight for makes you more formidable, not less? The possibility had never occurred to him. For years, he'd seen attachment as vulnerability, love as a liability. The idea that it could be otherwise left him unbalanced, uncertain. Thomas came here this morning offering security, stability, Grace continued. All the things a practical woman should want, Nathaniel nodded, steeling himself for her answer. And do you want those things? I told him no. The words were simple, direct. Yesterday, when he first approached me, Nathaniel blinked, trying to process this. You already refused him before he came here? A hint of a smile touched her lips. I did. He didn't take it well, hence his early morning appeal to you. But why? Nathaniel found himself struggling to understand. Everything he offers makes sense. He can give you and Susan. What about what I want to give Susan? Grace interrupted. A home where she's loved for exactly who she is, not as a secret to be kept. A father who teaches her courage and integrity, not just proper manners. She took a step closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes, smell the lavender water she used to rinse her hair. And what about what I want for myself? Her voice softened to barely above a whisper. A marriage that may have started as convenience, but has become something much more real to me than any practical arrangement could ever be. Nathaniel felt the ground shifting beneath him, possibilities opening that he'd never allowed himself to consider. Grace's eyes, the explosive crack of a rifle shot shattered the moment along with the front window. Glass sprayed across the room as Nathaniel instinctively tackled Grace to the floor, covering her body with his own as a second shot splintered the doorframe. Susan's terrified wails pierced the air from the bedroom. Montgomery's men, Nathaniel hissed, drawing his revolver. They've found us. Grace's eyes widened with fear, but her voice remained steady. Susan, we have to get to Susan! Another shot thudded into the wall above them. Keeping low, Nathaniel pulled Grace toward the hallway. Stay down, crawl. They made it to the bedroom as two more shots tore through the house. Susan stood in her crib, her little face red with screams of terror, tears streaming down her cheeks. Grace scooped her up, cradling her close, whispering frantic assurances against her dark curls. The cellar, Nathaniel directed, moving to a small rug in the corner of the room. He yanked it aside to reveal a trapdoor he'd installed weeks earlier, his contingency plan, his secret escape route. There's a tunnel that leads to the creek bed. Follow it until you reach the fallen oak. Then head for the church. Father Michael will hide you. Grace clutched Susan tighter. What about you? I'll cover your escape. Draw them away. He flung open the trap door, revealing narrow steps descending into darkness. Go, now. No! Grace shook her head vehemently. We stay together. The crash of the front door being kicked in emphasized the urgency of their situation. Nathaniel's expression hardened. This isn't a debate, Grace. Take Susan and go. I'll be right behind you. For a moment, he thought she would argue further, but Susan's continued cries seemed to decide her. Grace descended the steps, Susan clutched to her chest. Nathaniel followed, pulling the trapdoor closed above them just as heavy boots thundered into the bedroom. The cellar was pitch black, the air thick with the smell of earth and damp. Nathaniel struck a match, illuminating a low-ceilinged space with a narrow tunnel leading off to the right. Grace's face in the weak light was a study in controlled fear, her arms tight around Susan, who had quieted to whimpering sobs against her shoulder. Follow the tunnel, Nathaniel whispered, passing her the match. Don't stop. Don't look back. I'll hold them off here, Nathaniel. Fear made her voice tremble now. He cupped her face with one hand, his touch infinitely gentle despite the urgency of the moment. I have to know you're safe. Please, Grace. It was the plea that decided her. She nodded once, pressing her cheek briefly into his palm before turning toward the tunnel. The match flame wavered, casting long shadows as she bent to enter the low passage. Grace. His voice stopped her. In the dying light of the match, their eyes met one final time. No matter what happens, know that A thunderous crash from above cut off his words as the trapdoor splintered under the assault of rifle butts. Nathaniel pushed Grace into the tunnel. Go. The match went out as Grace scrambled forward. Susan clutched against her chest, the darkness swallowing them whole. Behind her, the sound of splintering wood gave way to shouts and the deafening report of Nathaniel's revolver as he fired upward through the breaking trapdoor. The last thing she heard as she rounded a bend in the tunnel was Nathaniel's voice, steady and clear despite the chaos. Come on, you bastards! Come and get me! Then there was only darkness, the sound of her own ragged breathing and Susan's muffled cries against her neck as Grace fled into the uncertain night, her heart torn between safety ahead and the man she loved fighting for their lives behind her. Grace's lungs burned as she stumbled through the darkness, one arm cradling Susan close, the other outstretched to feel her way through the narrow earthen tunnel. The child had quieted, perhaps sensing the desperate need for silence, her tiny fingers clutching the rough fabric of Grace's nightdress. The distant sounds of gunfire had faded, leaving only the pounding of Grace's heart and the soft whisper of her skirts dragging through the dirt. A cool draft of air brushed her face. The tunnel's end must be near. Grace quickened her pace, ignoring the sharp stones cutting into her bare feet. Susan whimpered against her neck. Hush, little one, she whispered, her lips against the child's silken curls. We're almost there. The tunnel widened, revealing a faint glimmer of starlight through a tangle of roots and brush. Grace pushed through the concealed opening, emerging into the silvery darkness of pre-dawn. The creek gurgled nearby, its waters black in the dim light. She oriented herself, spotting the massive fallen oak Nathaniel had mentioned. Beyond it lay the church and safety, if she could reach it. A horse's distant nickering froze her in place. Montgomery's men might have split up, some pursuing Nathaniel, others searching the surrounding area. Grace clutched Susan tighter and slipped into the shadows of the creek bed, the cold water soaking her nightdress to the knees. Lord, guide our steps, she murmured, more prayer than statement. Grace moved cautiously, keeping to the deepest shadows, using the skills she'd learned as a child gathering herbs in the wilderness. Step quietly, test each footfall, breathe slow and even. The frontier had taught her well. A woman alone must be self-reliant, vigilant. The church's weathered steeple appeared against the lightening sky, a silent sentinel promising sanctuary. Grace hesitated at the edge of the small clearing surrounding it. The building stood dark and seemingly abandoned, its windows gaping black holes in the gray stone walls. Another sound, the creak of a saddle, the soft jingle of spurs, sent her darting across the open ground toward the church's rear entrance. She reached the door, finding it secured with a rusted padlock. No, she breathed, desperation rising like bile in her throat. Susan stirred against her, sensing her fear. Grace circled the building, seeking another way in. A small window near the vestry, its glass long since broken, offered the only possibility. It would be a tight fit, especially with Susan, but they had no choice. Grace lifted Susan to meet her eyes. "I need you to be the bravest girl in Texas," she whispered. "We're going to climb through that window, and I need you to hold tight to me and not make a sound. Can you do that for Mama?" The words slipped out unbidden. Mama. Yet it felt right on her tongue. Susan regarded her solemnly, then buried her face in Grace's neck, her small arms tightening around her. Grace boosted herself onto a stone outcropping beneath the window, muscles straining as she maneuvered through the narrow opening with Susan clutched against her chest. Broken glass snagged her wrapper, tearing the fabric and scratching her leg. She bit back a cry of pain, focusing on lowering herself and Susan safely to the floor inside. The church's interior was thick with dust and shadow. Rows of pews stood like sentinels in the nave, while the altar at the far end was bare save for a tarnished candlestick. Grace moved deeper into the building, seeking a hiding place. The vestry, perhaps, or the unmistakable click of a revolver's hammer being drawn back froze her mid-step. My, drawled a voice from the shadows near the altar. "Ain't you a sight, Mrs. Hayes? Or should I say Midwife Sullivan?" A figure stepped into a shaft of dim light from a high window. He was tall and lean, with features that held an echo of Jeremiah Montgomery's infamous countenance, the same heavy brow and cruel mouth, though this man's face bore a wicked scar from temple to jaw. "Malcolm Montgomery," Grace breathed, instinctively turning to shield Susan with her body. "I'm flattered you know me." He gestured with his revolver. "Though I confess I expected you'd head for the livery or perhaps that doctor's place. The church was an inspired choice. How did you find you?" "Find you?" His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Darlin', we've been watching that little homestead of yours for days, just waiting for Hayes to leave you vulnerable." His gaze dropped to Susan. "And for my dear niece." Grace's mind raced, searching for options, for escape. The main doors were at her back, but Montgomery stood between her and any other exit. Susan trembled against her, somehow understanding the danger even at her tender age. "What do you want with us?" Grace asked, though she knew the answer well enough. Montgomery took a step closer, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "That child represents a considerable fortune, Mrs. Hayes, my late brother's legitimate heir." His eyes narrowed, "though I suspect you already know that." "She's just a baby," Grace protested, "innocent of any crime." "Indeed she is." Another step closer. "And she'll remain unharmed, provided you hand her over without fuss." Grace retreated a step, her back bumping against a pew. "You expect me to believe you'd care for her properly, a man who'd hunt down his own blood?" Something ugly flickered across Montgomery's face. "Catherine should have stayed where she belonged. My brother might have been a hard man, but she was his wife. She had no right to take what was his." "His child wasn't property," Grace said, her voice stronger than she felt. "No, but his fortune was." Montgomery's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Enough talk. Give me the child." Grace clutched Susan tighter. "She stays with me." Montgomery's scarred face twisted into a smile that chilled her blood. "Hayes must care for you both a great deal to risk so much. I wonder—" His gaze traveled down her nightdress with insulting deliberation. "Just how much he'd surrender to ensure no harm comes to you." The implication turned her stomach, but Grace kept her expression neutral. "Nathaniel won't bargain with the likes of you." Montgomery laughed, the sound echoing off the stone walls. "Oh, I think he will. Rangers have their weaknesses, same as any man. And you, my dear, are clearly his." He advanced steadily now, the revolver trained on her chest. "The way I see it, you have two choices. Hand over the child and walk away, or stay and face what happens when Hayes arrives to find you both my captives." Grace realized with sudden clarity what he intended. They weren't simply targets. They were bait. Montgomery expected Nathaniel to track them here, to walk into a trap set with the two people he'd sworn to protect. "Catherine's dead, isn't she?" The question escaped her lips before she could consider its wisdom. Montgomery paused, genuine surprise crossing his features before they settled into cruel amusement. "For some time now. Took a bullet meant for this little one." He nodded toward Susan. "Died believing Hayes would save her precious daughter. Romantic nonsense." A flicker of movement beyond Montgomery's shoulder caught Grace's attention, a shadow shifting against the wall near the vestry door. Her heart leapt, but she kept her expression carefully neutral, not daring to hope yet. "So, there's no one left to claim her inheritance but Susan," Grace said, playing for time, keeping Montgomery's attention fixed on her. "Which makes her quite valuable indeed." He extended his free hand. "Come now, be sensible. Give me the child, and perhaps I'll be merciful when Hayes arrives." Grace caught another glimpse of movement, closer now. Her mind raced, calculating distances, angles. She needed a distraction, something to draw Montgomery's aim away from her and Susan. "You know what I don't understand," she said, shifting her weight subtly to the right. "If Jeremiah died in a shootout, as Nathaniel told me, how are you still pursuing his fortune? Wouldn't you have been there, been captured or killed alongside him?" Anger flashed in Montgomery's eyes. "My brother was betrayed by someone in his inner circle. I was checking our northern properties when it happened." His expression darkened. "But I'll find the traitor eventually, after I settle matters with Hayes." The moment had come. Grace saw Nathaniel now, a shadow among shadows, easing closer behind Montgomery. In an instant she made her decision. "Susan," she said clearly, "wave to your uncle." As Montgomery's attention instinctively flicked to the child, Grace hurled the nearest object, a heavy Bible from the pew, directly at his head. It struck his shoulder, throwing off his aim as he fired reflexively, the bullet splintering the wood beside her head. Nathaniel lunged from the shadows, tackling Montgomery to the ground. They grappled for control of the revolver, a brutal dance of knees and elbows in desperate strength. Grace clutched Susan, backing away toward the vestry, searching for something, anything, to help turn the tide. The gun discharged again, the shot deafening in the confined space. Grace couldn't see who had been hit, could only make out the tangle of limbs on the floor. Then Nathaniel's voice, strained but steady. "Grace, the doors!" Understanding instantly, she ran to the main entrance, throwing back the heavy bolt. The doors swung open to reveal the first light of dawn, and 3 men with badges pinned to their vests, weapons drawn. "In here!" she called, her voice breaking with relief. The lawmen rushed past her. Within moments, they had Montgomery subdued and in irons, his face contorted with fury as they hauled him to his feet. Nathaniel rose more slowly, one hand pressed to his side where blood seeped through his shirt. "Nathaniel!" Grace hurried to him, Susan still clutched in one arm. "It's nothing," he assured her, though his pallor suggested otherwise. "Bullet grazed my ribs." His eyes searched her face, then Susan's. "Are you hurt?" Grace shook her head, relief making her knees weak. "How did you find us? How did you—" "I've been planning escape routes and contingencies since the day we arrived," Nathaniel said, wincing as he straightened. "Had a man watching the church just in case. When you didn't emerge from the tunnel, I feared the worst." One of the lawmen approached, touching his hat respectfully to Grace despite her disheveled appearance. "We've got Montgomery secured, Sheriff Hayes. 3 of his men are dead, back at your place, 2 more captured. Jackson's rounding up the last of them." Nathaniel nodded. "Good work, Deputy. Get them to the jail. I'll be along shortly to file charges." As the officers led a cursing Montgomery from the church, Nathaniel sagged against a pew, exhaustion etched in every line of his face. Grace settled beside him, Susan nestled between them. "You knew," she said quietly, "you knew Catherine was dead all along." Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly, then met her gaze squarely. "Yes, I should have told you from the beginning." "Why didn't you?" There was no accusation in her voice, only the need to understand. Nathaniel sighed, reaching out to touch Susan's dark curls with a gentleness that belied his ranger's calloused hands. "Catherine Montgomery was my informant within her husband's gang. For 2 years she passed information to me about their operations, their hideouts." His expression tightened with old grief. "She wanted out, wanted a normal life for her child, but feared what Jeremiah would do if she tried to leave. So she turned to the law," Grace said softly. "To you. When she learned she was with child, she became desperate. We planned her escape, but something went wrong. Jeremiah discovered her intentions." Nathaniel's voice grew rough. "I arrived too late. She'd been shot protecting Susan. With her last breath, she made me promise to keep her daughter safe, to ensure Susan would never fall into her uncle's hands. Grace studied his face, reading the layers of guilt and determination there. That's why you arranged our marriage? Not just to protect us, but to fulfill your promise to her. At first, yes. Nathaniel's gaze held hers steadily. It began as duty, as obligation, to a brave woman who died fighting for her child's future. And now? Grace couldn't keep the tremor from her voice. Nathaniel reached for her hand, his touch warm despite everything they'd endured. Now I understand what Catherine truly wanted for her daughter. Not just safety, but love. A real family. His fingers tightened around hers. Something I never thought I could offer. Something I convinced myself I had no right to seek. The morning light strengthened, spilling through the open church doors and washing over them in a gentle benediction. Susan had fallen asleep against Grace's chest, her face peaceful despite the night's terrors. It's over now, Nathaniel said, his voice low. Montgomery will hang for his crimes. Susan's inheritance will be secured in trust for her future. He hesitated, the words clearly difficult for him. I would understand if you wanted our arrangement dissolved now that the danger has passed. You could return to Cottonwood Springs, rebuild your practice, perhaps even reconsider Thomas's offer. Grace's heart constricted at the careful neutrality in his voice, at the way he avoided her eyes. After everything they'd survived, after the truths revealed, he still couldn't bring himself to ask for what he truly wanted. And what of your promises, Nathaniel Hayes? She asked softly, her free hand rising to touch his cheek. All of them, including the vow to cherish me all your days that you spoke but never meant to fulfill? Nathaniel's eyes widened, hope and uncertainty warring in their depths. Grace, we've had enough of half-truths between us, she interrupted gently. Tell me plain, was it only duty that brought you through that tunnel after us? Only obligation that made you face Montgomery when you could have sent your deputies? No. The word emerged rough with emotion. God help me, Grace, I love you. You and Susan both, I have for weeks now, though I've fought against it. With everything in me. His hand trembled as it covered hers against his cheek. But loving you doesn't change who I am, what I do. The dangers will never truly be gone. I'm not asking them to be. Grace smiled through tears that had begun to fall. I'm a frontier midwife, Nathaniel. I've never sought an easy path. What I want, what Susan and I both need, is a man who will walk the difficult roads alongside us, not shield us from them. The first true smile she'd ever seen transformed Nathaniel's face, erasing years of solitude and burden. Then you have him, if you'll have me. Not as a temporary protector, but as a husband in truth, a father to Susan. I believe, Grace said, leaning closer until their foreheads touched, that I already do. Between them, Susan stirred, her tiny hand reaching up to pat Nathaniel's beard. His laugh, warm and unburdened, joined Grace's softer one as the new day spilled golden light through the church windows, illuminating three people who had entered as strangers thrown together by circumstance, but who now stood united as what they had finally become, a family bound by choice, courage, and love. Chapter 8. Whispers of Forever. Golden light spilled across Cottonwood Springs Main Street as autumn painted the surrounding hills in russets and golds. The late October air carried the tang of wood smoke and spiced cider, mingling with the earthy scent of fallen leaves crushed beneath wagon wheels and hurrying feet. Atop an unsteady ladder, Nathaniel Hayes grimaced as he stretched to secure the final corner of the Harvest Festival banner. "Higher on your end, Sheriff," called Hiram Powell, the blacksmith, from the opposite boardwalk. "It's drooping worse than old Widow Parker's petunias." "If you're so particular about it," Nathaniel called back good-naturedly, "perhaps you'd care to climb up here yourself, Hiram." The blacksmith's booming laugh echoed down the street. "And deprive the ladies of watching our fine new lawmen perform feats of daring? I wouldn't dream of it." A chorus of female titters from the millinery shop confirmed Hiram's observation. Nathaniel shook his head, a reluctant smile lifting the corners of his mouth as he stretched higher, his badge catching the sunlight as he finally secured the corner of the banner. The bright cloth proclaimed Cottonwood Springs Harvest Festival 1875 in bold letters. "There," he announced, climbing down the ladder with care for the still tender scar along his ribs. "Will that satisfy the festival committee, Mrs. Holloway?" The dressmaker nodded her approval, her quick eyes noting the way he favored his left side. Perfectly positioned, Sheriff Hayes, though I do believe you might benefit from one of my Martha's liniment rubs for that old wound. Thank you, ma'am, but Grace has me well supplied with remedies, Nathaniel replied, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. I don't doubt it, Mrs. Holloway smiled. That wife of yours has half the town coming to her for tinctures and tonics. Why, her wild cherry cough syrup saved my Thomas from that dreadful chest cold last month. Pride warmed Nathaniel's chest at the mention of Grace. 3 months had transformed not only their lives, but the perception of Grace in Cottonwood Springs. Once merely tolerated for her skills, she was now sought after, respected, even beloved. Speaking of your lovely wife, continued Mrs. Holloway, adjusting her shawl against the autumn breeze, is it true she's convinced you to dance at the festival tomorrow night? My Josephine claimed she heard it from Bessie at the general store. Nathaniel cleared his throat, discomfort replacing his previous pleasure. I believe my wife has expectations in that direction, yes, ma'am. Wonderful, Mrs. Holloway clapped her hands. And will the famous author N.J. Hayes favor us with a waltz as well? Still can't believe Cottonwood Springs is home to both a Texas Ranger and a celebrated novelist. Mayor Granville approached before Nathaniel could formulate a response, sparing him from further discussion of his accidental literary impersonation. A story that had grown rather than diminished with each telling. Fine job with the banner, Sheriff, the mayor declared, puffing slightly from his hurried walk. Everything coming together splendidly for tomorrow. Word is we'll have visitors from as far as Fort Worth. Glad to hear it, Mayor. Nathaniel folded the latter, eager to complete his tasks and return home. Home. The word still carried a novel sweetness, even after 3 months. Before you go, the mayor continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially, any word on when we might expect a expansion of the Hayes family? Town's running a friendly wager, you understand. Most money's on a spring announcement. Heat crept up Nathaniel's neck. I believe that's between me and my wife, sir. The mayor had the good grace to look abashed. Of course. Just natural curiosity about our most prominent citizens. He cleared his throat. Speaking of your good wife, I've just come from her clinic. Little Susan is growing like a prairie weed, already pulling herself up on furniture, Mrs. Potts tells me. Nathaniel's expression softened at the mention of his daughter. Though not by blood, Susan had become his in every way that mattered. She's determined to walk before she crawls properly. Takes after her mother that way, stubborn as they come. A fine family you've made, Hayes, the mayor said, his tone sincere now. Cottonwood Springs is fortunate to have you. With a final nod, Nathaniel hefted the ladder and headed down the street toward the jailhouse. Everywhere the town bustled with preparations for tomorrow's celebration. Harvest wreaths adorned doorways while pumpkins and corn shocks decorated storefronts. Children darted between adults playing tag in the crisp afternoon sunshine. He stored the ladder in the narrow alley beside the jailhouse, then stepped inside to check on his single prisoner. Jedediah Sims, sleeping off last night's overindulgence at the saloon. The young deputy, Tommy Wilson, sat at the desk polishing his boots with military precision. Everything quiet, deputy? Nathaniel asked, hanging his hat on the wall peg. Tommy scrambled to his feet. Yes, sir, just old Jed snoring fit to wake the dead. The boy, for at 19 he was hardly more, looked at Nathaniel with undisguised admiration. Poster came in from Fort Worth. Nothing urgent. And there's a letter for you, sir. Came on the noon stage. Nathaniel took the envelope, immediately recognizing the precise handwriting of James Abernathy, Esquire, the lawyer who had been handling Susan's inheritance. I'll be heading home unless you need me, deputy. Remember, Mrs. Hayes expects you for supper at 6. Wouldn't miss it, sir. Tommy's enthusiasm was transparent. Your wife's venison stew is better than anything at the hotel. With a nod, Nathaniel retrieved his hat and stepped back into the afternoon sunshine, the letter tucked securely in his inner pocket. The walk to the edge of town where their new home stood took less than 15 minutes, but he savored every step. The events of the summer, the danger, the chase, the final confrontation with Montgomery seemed distant now, like a story from one of N.J. Hayes' novels rather than his own life. The two-story white clapboard house came into view as he rounded the bend, smoke curling from its chimney against the backdrop of crimson-leaved cottonwood trees that gave the town its name. Unlike Grace's original simple cabin that had burned in the attack, this home stood proud and welcoming, with a wide front porch and plenty of windows to catch the light Grace loved. Beside it, connected by a covered walkway, stood her clinic, smaller but equally well built. Both structures had risen from ashes and hope. The reward money for capturing the Montgomery gang had provided funds, but it was the townspeople's labor that had transformed plans into reality. Men who had once viewed Grace with suspicion for her unconventional independence had raised walls and set roof beams, while women who had whispered behind her back now brought curtains and preserves to welcome her home. Nathaniel paused at the gate, drinking in the sight of Grace's herb garden, where late-blooming marigolds and sage provided splashes of color against the weathered fence. A familiar yearning tightened his chest, not the restless hunger that had driven him for years as a ranger, but a deeper, steadier pull toward the life he'd found within those walls. Before he could open the gate, the front door swung wide. Captain Emmett Fuller, silver-haired and straight-backed despite his 60 years, appeared with Susan perched on his hip, her dark curls riotous around her cherubic face. The retired ranger captain had arrived unexpectedly last month to check on his best man, and somehow never left, taking a room at the boarding house but spending most days with Susan while Grace tended patients. "There's your pa, little miss," the captain announced, his gruff voice softening as it always did for Susan, right on time, as a proper lawman should be. Susan squealed with delight, reaching pudgy arms toward Nathaniel. The simple action never failed to humble him. This child who had accepted him completely, who looked at him with such unguarded trust. "Has she been running you ragged, Captain?" Nathaniel asked, taking Susan into his arms. She immediately grabbed for his badge, a favorite plaything. "This little filly," the captain snorted. "She's spirited, sure enough, but nothing compared to breaking wild mustangs. We've been having fine adventures, haven't we, Miss Susan?" Susan babbled an incomprehensible response, patting Nathaniel's cheek with sticky fingers that smelled suspiciously of molasses. "Been sampling Mrs. Potts's cookies again, I see," Nathaniel observed, pressing a kiss to Susan's forehead. "Medicinal purposes," declared the captain with a wink. "Girl needs sweetening to grow properly." The sound of voices from the clinic drew their attention. The door opened to reveal Grace escorting Mrs. Jensen, whose swollen belly suggested she'd be requiring Grace's midwifery skills before winter's end. "Remember, plenty of rosehip tea for the iron, Mrs. Jensen," Grace was saying. "And send your Henry for me at the first sign of the baby dropping." "Yes, Mrs. Hayes, thank you kindly." Mrs. Jensen bobbed a curtsy, then nodded to Nathaniel and the captain before making her way down the path. Grace stood framed in the doorway, wisps of honey-brown hair escaping her simple bun, her apron bearing traces of the herbs she'd been grinding. The sight of her, capable, warm, utterly herself, caught at Nathaniel's heart as it did every time. "You're home early," she observed, her smile reaching the amber flecks in her hazel eyes. "Banner all hung to the town's satisfaction." "After considerable debate," Nathaniel confirmed, crossing to the clinic steps. Susan lunged toward Grace, nearly toppling from his arms in her eagerness. Grace laughed, taking the baby and settling her on her hip with practiced ease. "And how was my little helper today? Did you and Captain Fuller solve all the territory's problems?" "We've formed a committee to address pressing matters," the captain replied seriously, "starting with whether raisin pudding is superior to apple cobbler." "A fundamental question of governance," Grace agreed, her eyes twinkling. "And the verdict? Split decision. Further investigation required." The captain straightened his waistcoat importantly. "Speaking of which, I believe I promised to deliver Mrs. Potts's basket to the church before sundown. Festival preparations and all." Nathaniel recognized the captain's transparent attempt to give them privacy. "We'll see you at supper, then?" "Wouldn't miss it." The old ranger tipped his hat to Grace, chucked Susan under the chin, and strode down the path with the vigor of a man half his age. "That man spoils her shamelessly," Grace observed as they watched him go. "Says the woman who rocks her for an hour after she's already asleep," Nathaniel countered, placing his hand at the small of Grace's back to guide her inside. The home they'd built together welcomed them with warmth and the mingled scents of beeswax, dried herbs, and the venison stew simmering on the cookstove. Unlike the temporary house in Fort Worth, every corner of this place bore the imprint of their shared life. Nathaniel's books beside Grace's medical texts on the shelves, Susan's wooden blocks scattered on the rag rug, the quilt Grace's mother had made draped over the settee. Susan squirmed to be set down, and Grace complied, watching fondly as the baby crawled determinedly toward her favorite toy, a carved wooden horse Nathaniel had made during the long evenings of her convalescence. "A letter came for you today," Nathaniel said, withdrawing the envelope from his pocket. "From Abernathy." Grace's expression grew serious. "About Susan's inheritance?" "I believe so." He broke the seal and unfolded the crisp pages, scanning the legal language until he found the passage that mattered most. "He's done it," Nathaniel said, relief evident in his voice. "The court has recognized Susan as Jeremiah Montgomery's legitimate heir and established the trust fund for her future. The Montgomery properties that were legally acquired, the lumber mill, the cattle ranch near Houston, have been sold, with the proceeds to be held until she comes of age." Grace sank onto the settee, watching Susan, who remained blissfully unaware that her future had just been secured. So it's truly over. The danger, the uncertainty, all of it. Nathaniel sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "What was meant as her burden has become her blessing. Abernathy estimates the trust will provide enough for a fine education, perhaps even university studies if she's so inclined." Grace's eyes widened. "University? For a girl?" "Times are changing, my love," Nathaniel smiled. "And our daughter will have choices neither of us dreamed possible at her age." Grace leaned against him, her head finding its familiar place on his shoulder. "Our daughter," she repeated softly. How quickly that became true. They sat in companionable silence, watching as Susan abandoned the horse in favor of pulling herself up on the edge of the low table, her little face scrunched in concentration. "Mrs. Holloway mentioned you've committed me to dancing tomorrow night," Nathaniel said finally, his tone mock-aggrieved. Grace laughed, the sound as bright as the golden afternoon light streaming through the windows. "I may have suggested you possessed hidden talents on the dance floor." She turned to face him, mischief in her eyes. "Was I mistaken, Sheriff Hayes?" "Grievously," he assured her, though his arms encircled her waist. "Rangers aren't known for their grace at social gatherings." "Then it's fortunate you have a patient teacher." She rose, pulling him to his feet. "Susan will expect to see her father cutting a fine figure at her first harvest festival." Before he could protest, Susan let out a triumphant crow. They turned to see her standing unassisted, wobbling like a new colt, but undeniably upright on her own 2 feet. "Nathaniel, look," Grace whispered, clutching his arm. For 3 heartbeats, Susan maintained her precarious balance, beaming with pride at her accomplishment. Then she took one lurching step forward before plopping unceremoniously onto her well-padded bottom. Rather than crying, she giggled delightedly, as if she'd played the finest joke on them all. "Did you see that?" Grace exclaimed, dropping to her knees beside Susan. "You clever, wonderful girl. You took a step." "Like her mother," Nathaniel said softly, kneeling beside them both, never content to stay in one place when there's somewhere new to explore. The moment crystallized in Nathaniel's heart, his wife's joyful face, his daughter's triumphant smile, the home they'd built from nothing but hope and stubborn courage. A year ago, he'd been a solitary man with nothing but duty to warm him. Now, wealth beyond counting filled his days. The following evening, lanterns illuminated Cottonwood Springs Town Square, casting a golden glow over trestle tables laden with harvest bounty. Pumpkin pies, apple cobblers, and spice cakes vied for attention alongside roasted meats and vegetables from local gardens. Banjo and fiddle music spilled from the platform where the town's most musical citizens performed, while couples twirled in the cleared space before them. Grace moved among the townspeople, Susan balanced on her hip, accepting compliments on her cranberry preserves that had earned a blue ribbon in the festival competition. Her forest green dress, hastily finished the night before, brought out the rich auburn highlights in her hair, which she'd left partly down at Nathaniel's request, secured with a simple tortoiseshell comb. "Mrs. Hayes," Mrs. Potts hurried toward her, cheeks flushed with excitement. "You simply must come see. The most distinguished gentleman just arrived on the evening stage. They say he's a famous author from back east." Grace glanced toward the jailhouse where Nathaniel had been called to handle a minor dispute between two farmers. "An author? And in Hayes himself," Mrs. Potts exclaimed. "Can you imagine? After all the stories about your husband using his name in Justice Mills, the newspaper editor has him cornered by the punch bowl." A flutter of apprehension stirred in Grace's stomach. Though months had passed since Nathaniel's impersonation of the famous writer, the story had grown with each retelling. What if the real author took offense? "I should find Nathaniel," Grace said, scanning the crowded square. "No need, my dear. I've found you instead." Nathaniel appeared at her elbow, looking surprisingly untroubled by the news. "And it seems we have a special guest, eager to make our acquaintance." He guided her through the crowd toward the refreshment tables where a distinguished man in his 50s held court. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a magnificent silver mustache and twinkling blue eyes, the stranger bore little resemblance to Nathaniel beyond their similar height. "Ah, here they are!" exclaimed Harold Jenkins, the newspaper editor. "Mr. Hayes, may I present Sheriff Nathaniel Hayes and his wife Grace, and their delightful daughter, Susan." The author's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "Sheriff Hayes, the man who borrowed my identity for a noble cause, I'm told." His voice held no anger, only amused curiosity. Nathaniel extended his hand, meeting the author's gaze directly. "Mr. Hayes, I owe you an apology for the liberties taken with your name. Circumstances at the time were unusual. So I've gathered from Mr. Jenkins' colorful account." The author shook Nathaniel's hand firmly. "Involving a dangerous outlaw, a orphaned heiress, and a brave midwife, if I understand correctly." Grace shifted Susan to her other hip, uncertain whether to be mortified or amused by the situation. "I assure you, Mr. Hayes, it wasn't planned. A case of mistaken identity that escalated." "My dear Mrs. Hayes," the author replied, his eyes crinkling with genuine warmth, "I've built my career on tales of adventure and romance in these wild territories. To discover my name played a small role in a real-life drama more compelling than any I've written? That's not cause for offense, but celebration." Relief washed through Grace as Nathaniel's tension visibly eased beside her. Susan, not to be ignored, chose that moment to reach for the author's impressive mustache with determined fingers. "Susan," Grace gently restrained her daughter's exploring hand. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Hayes." The author laughed heartily. "A discerning critic, your daughter clearly recognizes that my most distinguishing feature requires significant maintenance." He wiggled his mustache comically, delighting Susan into a cascade of giggles. "Mr. Hayes has been sharing his plans for his next novel," Jenkins interjected eagerly. "Tell them, sir." The author's expression grew thoughtful as he studied Nathaniel and Grace. "I find myself captivated by the story Jenkins has shared. A Texas Ranger and a frontier midwife joining forces to protect an innocent child from danger. With your permission, I'd like to use it as inspiration for my next work." Nathaniel glanced at Grace, surprise evident in his expression. "You want to write about us?" "A fictional version, naturally," the author assured them. "Names changed, details altered for dramatic effect. But the essence? A man of the law and a healing woman finding love while protecting a child. That's literary gold, Sheriff Hayes." Before they could respond, the fiddle music swelled, and Mayor Granville stepped onto the small platform. "Ladies and gentlemen of Cottonwood Springs, it's my great pleasure to announce we have a most distinguished visitor at our humble festival, the celebrated author, Mr. Nathaniel James Hayes." The crowd erupted in applause as the author stepped forward with a theatrical bow. "Thank you for your warm welcome. I must say, your lovely town has captured my imagination completely, particularly the remarkable story of your sheriff and his family." A murmur of excitement rippled through the gathering, the author continued, his voice carrying easily across the square. "With their blessing, my next novel shall feature a heroic midwife and a stalwart ranger protecting a precious child across the wilderness of Texas. I can think of no finer tribute to true courage than sharing this tale with readers throughout our great nation." The cheers that followed were deafening. As the author acknowledged the crowd's enthusiasm, Nathaniel leaned close to Grace's ear. Are you comfortable with this, becoming characters in one of his tales? Grace watched the animated faces of their neighbors, saw the pride with which they claimed connection to a story worthy of a famous author's attention. We're already characters in Cottonwood Springs' story, she replied softly. This just gives Susan something to laugh about when she's grown. Nathaniel's arm slipped around her waist as the music changed to a waltz. Speaking of laughter, I believe I am expected to demonstrate my dancing prowess tonight. Sheriff Hayes! It was Mrs. Potts, hurrying toward them with outstretched arms. Allow me to mind little Susan while you two enjoy the dancing. It's not often we see our sheriff and his lady take a turn about the floor. Before Grace could protest, Susan went willingly into Mrs. Potts's ample embrace, clearly anticipating more molasses treats in her future. Nathaniel took advantage of their suddenly free hands to lead Grace toward the dancing area. I warn you, he murmured as his hand settled at her waist. Rangers learn tracking and shooting, not proper dance steps. Grace smiled up at him as they began to move with the music. Good thing I'm not looking for proper, then. As they circled the makeshift dance floor, familiar faces smiled and nodded. Deputy Tommy Wilson danced enthusiastically, if awkwardly, with the baker's daughter. Captain Fuller regaled a circle of wide-eyed children with what appeared to be a heavily embellished ranger tale. And, approaching from the edge of the gathering, came an unexpected figure. Thomas Blackwood, looking prosperous in a fine suit, a lovely dark-haired woman on his arm. Grace, Nathaniel, Thomas greeted them as the waltz ended. Forgive the unexpected appearance. We were passing through on our way to Houston and heard about the festival. Thomas. Grace accepted his polite bow with a genuine smile. The awkwardness of their last parting in Fort Worth long faded. How lovely to see you. May I introduce my fiancée, Miss Eleanor Harrington? Thomas presented the young woman beside him with evident pride. Eleanor, this is Grace Hayes and her husband, Sheriff Hayes. The midwife and the ranger. Eleanor's face lit with recognition. Thomas has told me so much about you both. Your story is positively romantic. Grace exchanged an amused glance with Nathaniel. Life has certainly taken unexpected turns. For all of us, Thomas agreed, his gaze settling on Eleanor with unmistakable devotion. Eleanor's father is expanding his cattle operations into the Panhandle. We'll be overseeing the new ranch after our spring wedding. Congratulations to you both, Nathaniel said, extending his hand to Thomas without reservation. As they exchanged pleasantries, Grace observed the easy way Eleanor leaned into Thomas, the perfect symmetry of their aspirations and temperaments. What had once seemed like lost opportunity now revealed itself as providence. Thomas had needed someone who shared his ambitions for society and success, just as she had needed. Her gaze drifted to Nathaniel, solid and steady beside her, his hand instinctively finding hers as they conversed. They fit together, not because they were alike, but because their differences created balance. His caution with her impulse, her openness with his reserve, his strength with her healing touch. The evening progressed with more dancing, feasting, and celebration. The real N.J. Hayes regaled the crowd with dramatic readings from his works, while children bobbed for apples and young couples slipped away for moonlit walks. Through it all, Grace and Nathaniel moved as a unit, separating briefly to converse with neighbors or check on Susan, but always returning to each other's side as naturally as breathing. As the festivities began to wind down, Nathaniel touched Grace's elbow. Captain Fuller has offered to see Susan home to bed. Says it's a grandfather's privilege. He's not even attempting to maintain his gruff exterior anymore, Grace observed with a smile, watching the captain lift a sleepy Susan onto his shoulders. Complete surrender to a 9-month-old tyrant. Some battles aren't worth fighting, Nathaniel agreed, his eyes warm as they followed the pair's departure. When they disappeared down the lantern-lit street, he turned to Grace. Walk with me? She nodded, allowing him to guide her away from the dwindling celebration toward the quieter edge of town. The night air had grown crisp, and he draped his coat around her shoulders, his arm following to draw her close against his side. They walked in companionable silence until they reached the small bridge spanning Cottonwood Creek. Moonlight silvered the rippling water below, while the namesake trees rustled softly in the autumn breeze. Grace leaned against the wooden railing, drinking in the peaceful scene. I received another letter today, Nathaniel said, his voice quiet in the darkness. From the ranger headquarters in Austin. A flutter of apprehension stirred in Grace's chest. Oh? They've offered me a promotion. Senior captain, overseeing rangers across 3 counties. His hand covered hers where it rested on the railing. It would mean occasional travel, but Cottonwood Springs would remain our home base. Relief flooded through her. You were worried about telling me? Not worried, exactly. He turned to face her, his expression earnest in the moonlight. After everything we've been through, I wanted to be certain you understood that you and Susan come first now. The Rangers may have my service, but you have my heart. Grace reached up to touch his cheek, feeling the slight roughness of evening stubble beneath her fingers. I never doubted that, Nathaniel. Not since that night in the church when you finally told me the whole truth. His hand covered hers, turning to press a kiss against her palm. There's one more truth I haven't shared. What's that? She asked softly. I've been carrying this for weeks, waiting for the right moment. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. Our wedding was hasty, practical, born of necessity rather than choice. From the pouch, he produced a slender gold band set with a small but perfect diamond that caught the moonlight in fiery brilliance. Grace Sullivan Hayes, he said, his voice deepening with emotion. I find myself in the remarkable position of asking a woman who is already my wife to be my wife. Not from duty or obligation or protection, but because loving you has become as essential to me as breathing. Tears welled in Grace's eyes as he took her left hand where the simple band from their first ceremony already rested. Every day with you and Susan teaches me what I was fighting for all those years, not just law or justice in the abstract, but the chance for good people to build lives of meaning and joy. The new ring slipped alongside the first, a perfect complement. The vows I spoke months ago in a dusty judge's office have become the truest words I've ever said. I will cherish you all my days, Grace. That's a promise made not from duty, but from the deepest places of my heart. Grace's fingers curled around his, the rings catching moonlight as she stepped into his embrace. I knew you know, she whispered against his chest. Even then, when you were so determined to keep your distance, I saw the man beneath the badge, the man who had become my husband in truth as well as name. His arms tightened around her as he pressed a kiss to her hair. How did you know when I hadn't even admitted it to myself? She looked up at him, her smile as bright as the stars overhead, because every time you looked at Susan, I saw the father she deserved. And every time you looked at me when you thought I wouldn't notice, I saw the husband I'd been waiting for without even knowing it. Their kiss was gentle at first, then deepened, with the assurance of a love tested by fire and emerged stronger. Around them, the prairie wind whispered through cottonwood leaves, carrying the distant notes of fiddle music and the promise of seasons yet to come. Harvest giving way to winter's rest, then spring's renewal, summer's abundance, and harvest once again, the eternal cycle that would mark the years of their life together. When they finally turned toward home, Grace's head rested against Nathaniel's shoulder, their steps perfectly matched despite their different heights. Ahead, lamplight glowed in the windows of the house they'd built together, where Susan slept safely and Captain Fuller likely dozed in the rocking chair, where tomorrow would bring new patients to heal and new challenges to face. Together. Mrs. Hayes, Nathaniel said as they approached their gate, may I have the honor of walking you home? Grace smiled up at the man who had begun as her protector and become her partner in all things. Always, Sheriff Hayes. For all our days to come. The harvest festival blazed with light and laughter long into the evening, but as midnight approached, Grace found herself yearning for the quiet sanctuary of home. A glance at Nathaniel, deep in conversation with the real N.J. Hayes and Mayor Granville, revealed the same weariness etched in the lines around his eyes, a contented exhaustion that came from celebration rather than strife. When she caught his gaze, no words were needed. He nodded almost imperceptibly, made his excuses to the gentleman, and crossed to where she stood, watching Susan doze in Captain Fuller's arms. Ready to retire, Mrs. Hayes? He asked softly, his hand finding the small of her back with the easy familiarity that still sent a pleasant warmth through her. The captain insists he can manage her for the walk home, Grace replied, smiling at the former ranger who had appointed himself Susan's honorary grandfather with such determination. Carried tougher loads through Apache territory, Captain Fuller declared, though his voice gentled as Susan stirred briefly against his shoulder. "This little lady and I understand each other perfectly." They made their farewells quietly, slipping away as the celebration continued behind them. The night embraced them with autumn's crisp clarity, stars strewn like diamond dust across the velvet sky. Their footsteps fell into natural rhythm along the path home, the silence between them comfortable as an old quilt. When they reached the gate of their new home, Nathaniel hesitated, his hand on the latch. "Walk with me a moment longer?" he asked, gesturing toward the wide front porch. Grace nodded, exchanging a knowing glance with Captain Fuller, who continued inside with his precious cargo. Nathaniel led her up the porch steps, his hand never leaving hers, and settled her on the swing he'd built and hung just last week, another piece of the home they were creating together. The porch stretched wide across the front of the house, its sturdy posts supporting a roof that offered shelter while leaving the view of the night sky unobstructed. From this vantage point, the town lay peaceful below them, festival lanterns still glowing in the distance like earthbound stars. Nathaniel sat beside her, the swing creaking gently as he set it in motion with one foot. For several heartbeats, they simply existed together in the quiet, the sounds of night insects and distant music weaving around them. "I never thought I'd have this," Nathaniel said finally, his voice carrying the hushed quality of a man speaking sacred truths. "A home, a family." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "A wife who sees me clearly and loves me anyway." Grace turned to study his profile in the starlight, the strong lines softened by the darkness, yet no less dear for it. "Is that what we have, Nathaniel? A family?" His eyes, when they met hers, held a vulnerability that still surprised her in this man who had faced gunfire without flinching. "We do if you want it, Grace. Not the arrangement we started with, but something real and lasting." He shifted on the swing to face her more fully. "These past months have taught me what I never allowed myself to learn before, that true strength comes not from standing alone, but from choosing to stand together." From his waistcoat pocket, he withdrew a small velvet pouch, its drawstring loosed by fingers that, for perhaps the first time in her memory, trembled slightly. "This belonged to my mother," he said, tipping a slender gold band into his palm. A single perfect diamond caught the starlight, sending tiny prisms dancing across their entwined hands. "It was the only thing I managed to save when we lost the ranch. I've carried it with me all these years, never imagining I'd find someone worthy of wearing it." Grace's breath caught as he lifted her left hand, where the simple band from their hastily arranged marriage rested. The words we spoke in Justice Mills were meant as protection, as duty, but somewhere along the way, they became the truest promise I've ever made. His voice deepened with emotion. "I want to make that promise again, Grace, not as a ranger protecting an innocent, but as a man who loves a woman beyond all reason or caution." The diamond slid onto her finger alongside the first ring, a perfect complement that transformed the practical band into something beautiful and complete, much as their practical arrangement had transformed into love. "Will you marry me again, Grace Sullivan Hayes?" Nathaniel asked, his eyes never leaving hers. "Not for Susan's sake, not for safety or propriety, but because I cannot imagine walking through this world without you beside me." Tears welled in Grace's eyes, spilling unchecked down her cheeks as she cupped his beloved face in her hands. "Yes," she whispered, the single word holding all the certainty her heart contained. 1,000 times, yes." Their kiss beneath the canopy of stars sealed a promise already written in their souls, long before either found the courage to speak it aloud. Dawn painted the eastern sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold as a small gathering assembled in Cottonwood Springs' whitewashed church. Sunlight poured through stained glass windows, casting jewel-toned patterns across the simple pine floors and the faces of those who had come to witness not a beginning, but a confirmation. A love that had forged itself in fire and emerged unbreakable. Grace wore no elaborate wedding gown, but a dress of cornflower blue that matched the autumn sky, adorned only with a spray of late-blooming wildflowers gathered at dawn by the youngest Jensen girl. Her hair fell in loose waves past her shoulders, secured with her mother's tortoise-shell combs, a touch of the past blessing the present. Nathaniel waited at the altar, looking more nervous than he had facing Montgomery's gang. Captain Fuller stood at his side as witness, while Susan, resplendent in a tiny white dress Widow Parker had stitched, balanced happily on the hip of old Dr. Wilson, who had helped raise Grace after her parents' passing. When Reverend Thompson nodded to the small assembly, Grace walked the short aisle alone, a woman making her own choice. A strength Nathaniel had never sought to diminish, but rather treasured as the heart of who she was. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, the familiar liturgy taking on new meaning with each word. When the time came for their vows, Nathaniel took both her hands in his, the practiced speech of a lawman, giving way to raw sincerity. Grace, when you found Susan on your porch that spring morning, you opened your heart without reservation, offering protection and love to a child who needed both desperately. His voice carried clearly to every corner of the small church. When I arrived at your door with danger at my heels, you showed the same courage. Not foolhardy bravery, but the deeper valor of choosing compassion over fear. His hands tightened on hers, the calluses of a lifetime's hard work gentle against her skin. I promise to cherish your strength as much as your tenderness, your wisdom as much as your passion. I vow to stand beside you in all seasons, in joy and sorrow, in bounty and hardship. Not as your protector, but as your partner in all that life brings. His eyes, usually so guarded, shone with unashamed emotion. And I promise before God and these witnesses to love you with every breath I draw until my last day on this earth. Grace blinked back tears that would not be denied, her heart too full for artifice or restraint. Nathaniel, when you proposed our arrangement, I thought I understood what protection meant. Walls and weapons and watchful eyes, but you taught me that true safety comes from being fully known and loved anyway. A smile trembled on her lips as Susan cooed from Dr. Wilson's arms, as if adding her own affirmation. I promise to be your haven when the world demands too much, your courage when doubt creeps in, your joy when shadows lengthen. I vow to cherish the man beneath the badge, the one who rocks our daughter to sleep and builds swings for starlight contemplation. Her voice steadied with each word, conviction lending it strength. I promise to walk beside you through whatever paths God sets before us, not following, not leading, but together hand in hand. And I vow to love you with a heart that chose you freely, completely, and eternally. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, again Nathaniel gathered her close with a tenderness that belied his ranger's strength. Their kiss, witnessed by those who had become their family by choice rather than blood, spoke of promises kept and adventures yet to come. As they turned to face their small congregation, the church bells began to peal unexpectedly, their joyous clangor spilling across Cottonwood Springs in bright waves of sound. Grace looked questioningly at Reverend Thompson, who merely smiled and gestured toward the doors. They stepped into the autumn sunshine to find the churchyard transformed. Trestle tables groaned beneath covered dishes, while bright bunting fluttered from every available surface. It seemed half the town had gathered, faces beaming with the special satisfaction of a well-executed surprise. "What is this?" Grace whispered, astonished at the turnout. Mayor Granville stepped forward, clearly delighted with their stunned expressions. "Couldn't let our sheriff and midwife renew their vows without proper celebration, could we? Every family you've helped through birth or illness wanted to honor you both." Mrs. Jensen approached with a beautiful quilt composed of squares contributed by different households. "For the family that stitched our community back together," she said, placing it in Grace's arms with a curtsy. The Widow Parker presented a lovingly crafted wooden cradle. "For the little one, and perhaps others to follow," she added with a knowing wink that brought color to Grace's cheeks. One by one, families came forward with offerings both practical and precious. Preserves and pies, handcrafted furniture, books for Susan, herbs for Grace's medical stores, even a fine leather gun belt for Nathaniel, tooled with his initials. As fiddle music struck up a lively tune, children darted between clusters of adults playing impromptu games of tag while young couples began to dance in the cleared space before the church steps. The celebration had the spontaneous joy of a community expressing gratitude in the most tangible ways they knew, through food and music, craft and company. Captain Fuller appeared with Susan, who reached immediately for Nathaniel with the absolute confidence of a child who knew her father's arms would always be waiting. "Seems your daughter objects to being left out of the merriment," the captain observed dryly, though his weathered face softened, as it always did around the child. "She comes by her sociable nature honestly," Dr. Wilson observed, watching Grace already deep in conversation with Mrs. Potts about remedies for winter coughs. The day unfolded in a tapestry of small, perfect moments. Nathaniel dancing with Susan perched on his boots, Grace sharing remedies with young mothers, the real N.G. Hayes regaling wide-eyed children with tales of adventure while taking copious notes for his next novel. As afternoon mellowed toward evening, the gathering showed no signs of dispersing, the community reluctant to relinquish this unexpected holiday. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western hills, Grace caught Nathaniel's eye across the churchyard. No words were needed between them now, a lifetime of understanding compressed into months of shared struggle and joy. With gracious thanks and promises to see everyone at Sunday services, they made their way home, Susan drowsy against Nathaniel's shoulder, their arms laden with tokens of their neighbor's esteem. Night settled gently over Cottonwood Springs, wrapping the little town in star-spangled darkness. On the wide porch of the house that had risen from ashes and hope, Nathaniel rocked steadily in the swing, Susan curled against his chest like a drowsy kitten. Her dark lashes fluttered against cheeks flushed with excitement and the exertion of her first real celebration, her tiny fingers clutching the edge of the quilt. Mrs. Jensen had gifted them. Grace emerged from the house with 2 steaming cups of coffee, the domestic scene before her catching at her heart with its simple perfection. How far they had traveled from that first tense meeting in her old cabin, when the Texas Ranger had appeared on her doorstep demanding to see the abandoned baby she'd taken in. "Is she finally surrendering to sleep?" Grace asked softly, settling beside them and passing Nathaniel one of the cups. "Fighting it with her usual determination," he replied, his smile evident in his voice. "She comes by her stubbornness honestly." "I wonder which one of us she inherited that from," Grace teased, her head finding its natural resting place against his shoulder. His chuckle rumbled beneath her ear, a sound as precious for its rarity as for its warmth. "Some mysteries are best left unsolved, Mrs. Hayes." They sat in companionable silence, the gentle creak of the swing and Susan's deepening breaths creating a lullaby more soothing than any melody. The prairie stretched beyond their porch, vast and silvered by moonlight, the same view Grace had gazed upon from her old cabin, yet everything had changed. "I've been thinking," Nathaniel said eventually, his voice low to avoid disturbing Susan's precarious slumber. "Dr. Wilson mentioned again today that he's considering retirement." Grace nodded against his shoulder. "He's been saying that for years. This time he seems in earnest. Says his hands aren't steady enough for delicate work anymore." Nathaniel's free hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with practiced ease. "And asked if you'd consider expanding your practice beyond midwifery, taking on some of his patients." Grace sat straighter, surprise widening her eyes. "Truly? But I'm not a proper doctor. I never had formal training." "He says you have more healing skill in your little finger than most medical school graduates have in their entire bodies." Nathaniel's expression held quiet pride. "Says he'd be honored to mentor you through whatever additional knowledge you might need." The possibility unfurled in Grace's mind like a flower opening to sunlight. She had always loved her work bringing babies into the world, but the chance to serve her community in a broader capacity, to use the knowledge she'd gathered through years of careful observation and practice, it would mean expanding the clinic, she said thoughtfully. Perhaps taking on an apprentice of my own eventually. "The east side of the house has room for an addition," Nathaniel offered. "I could speak with the builders who helped with the original construction." Grace's mind raced with possibilities, the future opening before them rich with promise and purpose. And what of you? Will being tied to a doctor's wife suit a Texas Ranger accustomed to the open trail? Nathaniel shifted Susan to a more comfortable position, his movements practiced and gentle. "This ranger has discovered that home holds adventures more rewarding than any trail." His eyes, so often guarded in the past, held nothing but openness as they met hers. "Besides, Cottonwood Springs needs its sheriff, and I find myself surprisingly content with a badge that allows me to sleep in my own bed each night, with my wife beside me. A comfortable silence settled between them again, broken only when Susan sighed in her sleep, one tiny hand uncurling to rest against Nathaniel's chest, directly over his heart. "I've been wondering something," Nathaniel said finally, his voice thoughtful in the darkness. "There are other children like Susan out there, orphaned, abandoned, in need of homes where they'll be valued rather than just tolerated." Grace's heart quickened, understanding immediately where his thoughts led. "You're thinking of bringing another child into our family." "Not immediately," he clarified, "but perhaps when Susan is a little older, when the clinic is established. I thought—" He hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "I thought it might heal something to offer a home to children who need one, the way my family never had the chance to heal after what happened." Grace reached up to touch his face, feeling the slight roughness of evening stubble beneath her fingertips. "I think it's a beautiful vision, Nathaniel. A house filled with children who are cherished for exactly who they are, not what they might provide or become." His expression lightened, as if a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten its presence had finally lifted. "We could build another bedroom off the back. Perhaps two." Grace laughed softly. "Let's master raising one child before we fill the house with more." Susan stirred at the sound of her mother's laughter, her dark lashes fluttering briefly before settling back into deeper sleep. Nathaniel gazed down at their daughter, for Susan was truly theirs now in heart and soul, if not in blood, his expression holding a wonder that never failed to touch Grace deeply. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Finding that basket on your porch? All that followed, the danger, the upheaval, having to rebuild everything you'd worked for?" Grace considered the question seriously, as she did all things. The memories cascaded through her mind. The terror of that night when Montgomery's men burned her cabin, the confusion of their hasty wedding, the painful arguments when Nathaniel tried to maintain his emotional distance, the gunfire and fear of their final confrontation with Montgomery's brother. So much had been lost, risked, endured. But when she weighed those hardships against what had been gained, this man beside her, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them, the home they'd built together, the community that had embraced them not for what they pretended to be, but for who they truly were, there was no contest. She reached up to kiss him gently, pouring all the certainty of her heart into the simple gesture. When she drew back, her eyes held his steadily in the starlight. "Some gifts come wrapped in unexpected packages," she whispered, her fingers brushing Susan's silken curls. "But they're no less precious for how surprisingly they arrive." Her hand found his again, the rings catching moonlight as their fingers intertwined. "You were right that first night in my old cabin. God did send Susan to fill the emptiness in my heart. But he sent you too, Nathaniel Hayes. And in doing so, he gave me more than I ever dared dream possible." The prairie wind whispered around them, carrying the scent of autumn earth and wood smoke, the promise of seasons yet to come. Susan slumbered peacefully between them, secure in the absolute certainty that she was loved beyond measure, and as night deepened toward midnight, Nathaniel and Grace remained on their porch, no longer three strangers thrown together by circumstance, but a family bound by choice, courage, and a love that had transformed duty into devotion and arrangement into forever.